What would you do if the key to your entire future was locked inside a box everyone else called trash? What if you had to bid everything you had, not just your money but your reputation, for a fire-blackened, fused-shut strongbox at a public auction? For one young woman, this wasn't a question. It was the only path back to a life that had been stolen from her. She was about to buy a piece of wreckage for the price of a small ranch, and the whole town was laughing. But what they didn't know was that she had watched her father hide the truth inside that box, just one day before they hanged him. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell the story of Greta Lowell and the inheritance nobody else could see. The dust of Redemption Creek tasted the same as she remembered, like rust, regret, and broken promises. Greta Lowell, barely 21 but feeling 100 years older, drew the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders as the stagecoach rattled to a halt. It was the first time she had set foot in the town in the 5 years since they had sent her away, a child made an orphan by a rope and a lie. Her father, Thomas Lowell, had been a good man, a fair man, a man who saw land not as something to be conquered, but as a partner to be understood. He had owned the entire Sweetwater Valley, a stretch of land so green and well-watered. It was a jewel in the harsh Montana landscape, and Silas Thorne's father had wanted it. So he had framed Thomas for cattle rustling, a crime so beneath him it was laughable. Yet a jury of men indebted to the Thornes had found him guilty. Greta had been put on a coach to an orphanage in the east before her father's body was even cold. Now she was back, with nothing to her name but a handful of dollars saved from years of mending and cleaning, and a memory that burned hotter than any fire. She had come for the auction, a fire, they'd said in the letter from Jed, her father's old ranch hand. A fire in the town hall had destroyed the records office. They were auctioning off what little was salvaged. Jed's letter had been short, but one line had stopped her heart. They pulled out your father's old strongbox, blackened but whole. Greta had closed her eyes and been transported back to the night before the hanging. Her father, his face a mask of calm despair, pressing his hand to the cold steel of that box in his office. Everything that matters is in here, Greta. Don't ever forget the feel of this lock. Don't ever forget the land. She stepped down from the coach, keeping her head low. The town was a chorus of whispers already. Is that Lowell's girl? What's she doing back here? She ignored them, her gaze fixed on the makeshift auction block set up in the town square. Her worn leather boots, the same ones her father had bought her a lifetime ago, made no sound in the thick dust. Her loyal old friend, Jedediah, was waiting by the livery, his face a roadmap of worry. He was older, grayer, but his eyes held the same kindness. He didn't speak, just gave a short, sharp nod and took her small, threadbare bag. "Heard you were coming," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "Figured you might need a friend." Greta could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She wasn't just here for a box. She was here for justice, for the memory of a good man. The weight of that task felt heavier than any mountain, but as she looked at the hostile faces in the crowd, a spark of her father's stubbornness kindled in her chest. They had taken everything from her once. They would not do it again. The auctioneer was climbing onto the platform now, his voice beginning to boom across the square, and Greta moved toward the sound, a ghost returning to her own haunting. The auctioneer, a man with a florid face and a voice like gravel in a tin can, worked his way through a predictable collection of singed desks, melted inkwells, and smoke-damaged chairs. The crowd was sparse, mostly loafers, and a few merchants looking for a bargain. Greta stood at the back, near Jed, her presence a quiet, unnerving ripple in the town's placid afternoon. Then, two men grunted as they hauled a heavy object onto the platform. It was the strongbox. It was worse than she had imagined. Charred, blistered, its ornate steel bindings warped into blackened claws. A wave of derisive laughter rippled through the crowd. Silas Thorne, magnificent in a tailored city suit, stepped forward. He was his father's son in every way, handsome, arrogant, and rotten to the core. He tapped the box with his silver-headed cane. "Well, look at this," he boomed, his voice dripping with contempt. "A coffin for secrets. What's the bid for a lump of burnt iron, Mr. Gable?" The auctioneer cleared his throat. "We'll start the bidding at $1. "Do I hear $1 for this relic?" Silence, broken only by a few snickers. Thorne laughed aloud. "I'll give you $1 to haul it to the dump." More laughter. Greta felt a cold, clean rage settle over her. She took a steadying breath. $2, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise like a shard of glass. Every head turned. Thorne's smile froze, then twisted into a mask of cruel amusement. "Well, well, little Greta Lowell. Come back to sift through the ashes," he turned to the auctioneer. $5. "10, Greta said, her eyes locked on the box. It was a promise. $20, Thorne snapped, his amusement souring into irritation. $50, Greta replied, her voice unwavering. The crowd was silent now, watching the strange duel. This wasn't about a box anymore. It was about the past, a battle fought with dollars instead of guns. Jed put a restraining hand on her arm. "Greta, that's half of what you've got." She didn't look at him. "100, she said, her gaze never leaving Thorne's. A gasp went through the crowd. $100 was a fortune, the price of a good horse and saddle. Thorne's face flushed a deep, angry red. He had expected her to crumble, to run away as she had been forced to do before. He wouldn't be made a fool of by the daughter of a hanged man. $200, he roared. The auctioneer's eyes were wide. This was the most excitement Redemption Creek had seen in years. Greta felt a moment of pure, terrifying doubt. 200 was everything. Every penny she had in the world. She looked at the box, and in her mind she saw her father's face. Everything that matters is in here. $201, she said, her voice barely a whisper. But it carried in the stunned silence. It was a declaration. It was all she had. Thorne stared at her, his jaw working. For a moment it seemed he would go on, simply to crush her. But then he saw the look in her eyes. Not defiance, not anger, but a certainty as deep and solid as the bedrock of the mountains. He saw that she would not stop. To continue would be to admit she cared. With a sneer, he threw up his hands. "Let the scavenger have her scrap heap. It's a fitting inheritance." He turned and stalked away. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, slamming his gavel. "To Miss Lowell, for $201. A heavy silence fell. Greta had won. But as she stood there, penniless and alone, staring at the burnt and broken box, she felt the crushing weight of what she had just done. What would you do with a victory that felt so much like a defeat? Was this quiet girl's gamble an act of foolish hope or a fool's errand? What secrets could possibly survive a fire hot enough to warp steel? Let us know what you think down in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of quiet courage. Now back to Greta and the heavy price of memory. The moment the gavel fell, the spell of the auction broke and the whispers began anew, this time laced with pity and scorn. Paid a fortune for a boat anchor. The girls lost her senses. Like father, like daughter, head full of rocks. Greta ignored them, her focus narrowed to the man she had just paid, counting out her entire life's savings in worn bills and tarnished coins. His hand hesitated before taking the last dollar. He looked from the money to her face, then to the box, and for a moment, a flicker of something, pity perhaps, crossed his features. But it was gone as quickly as it came. He swept the money into his pouch, and the transaction was complete. Silas Thorne had already disappeared into the saloon, no doubt to buy a round of drinks and laugh about the Lowell girl's folly. His laughter echoed in her mind, a phantom more real than the murmuring of the crowd. As she stood guard over her ruinously expensive purchase, Jed approached, his face etched with a deep concern that was more painful than any stranger's mockery. "Greta," he began, his voice low and gentle, "what have you done?" "I've done what I had to, Jed," she replied, her own voice sounding distant to her ears. She ran a hand over the rough, blistered surface of the box. It was still warm, though the fire had been weeks ago, as if it held the heat of all the town's judgment. Two men, hired by Jed with a few coins he could spare, loaded the Strongbox onto the back of his rickety wagon. It landed with a heavy, final thud that seemed to shake the very ground. As they tied it down, a figure detached itself from the shadows of the general store. It was an old woman, Alara, the town's laundress. Her face was a web of wrinkles, her eyes dark and knowing. She had been one of the few who had brought food to the jail for Thomas Lowell, one of the few who had not spat at his name. She shuffled over to Greta, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't speak for a long moment, simply looked from Greta's face to the box. Then, in a voice as dry and raspy as autumn leaves, she said, "Fire cleanses, but it also remembers what it has touched." Without another word, she turned and shuffled away, melting back into the shadows she had come from. The cryptic words hung in the air, a strange and unsettling blessing. Jed just shook his head, though he didn't question it. He helped her up onto the wagon seat. "The old homestead's still there," he said, flicking the reins. "What's left of it? Roof's gone in places, but it's a place to be." Greta looked back at the town of Redemption Creek as the wagon lurched into motion. The faces of the townspeople were a blur of condescension and dismissal. They had already written her off, just as they had her father. She had no money, no home, and no friends, but the aging man beside her, and the ghost of a father who had trusted her with his legacy. She turned her gaze forward, toward the jagged line of the mountains that held the Sweetwater Valley. The journey ahead was long, and the shelter at its end was a ruin. But for the first time in 5 years, she was heading home. The box in the back of the wagon was an anchor. Yes, but anchors weren't just for drowning. They were for holding fast in a storm, and a storm she knew was coming. The journey from the town to the valley was a pilgrimage through memory. Every rise in the road, every familiar bend in the creek brought a fresh wave of ghosts. Here was the flat rock where her father had taught her to skip stones. There was the grove of aspens where they had picnicked one summer, their laughter echoing in the thin mountain air. Now, the only sound was the creak of the wagon wheels and the plodding hoofbeats of Jed's tired mules. Beside them walked Pilgrim, her father's old gelding. Jed had kept him, fed him, and cared for him these 5 long years, a silent pact of loyalty. The horse was old now, his muzzle gone to gray, but when Greta had approached him at the livery, he had nickered softly and pushed his head into her chest, a living, breathing connection to everything she had lost. He followed the wagon without needing a lead, his gait slow but steady, his presence a quiet comfort at her side. As the sun began to dip below the western peaks, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, they crested the final ridge. There it was, the Sweetwater Valley, her home. It was as beautiful and as heartbreaking as she remembered. A long green finger of meadow and forest tucked into the embrace of the mountains. But the heart of it, the Lowell homestead, was a scar. The main house where she had been born was a collapsed skeleton of charred timbers, a victim of a stray lightning strike a year after her father's death, a convenient accident that had prevented anyone from ever taking possession. Only the small original cabin, the one her grandfather had built, still stood, though its roof sagged and its windows were dark, empty eyes. Jed pulled the wagon to a stop before the dilapidated structure. "This is as far as I can take you, girl," he said, his voice thick with unspoken emotion. "I'll be back in a few days with what supplies I can muster." He and Greta worked in the fading light to unload the Strongbox. It took all their strength to wrestle it from the wagon bed and drag it onto the dusty porch of the cabin. It sat there in the twilight, a dark and inscrutable monolith. Jed pressed a small bag into her hand. "Flour, salt, some coffee. It ain't much." He hesitated. "Are you sure about this, Greta? Thorne is not a man to be trifled with." My father was not a man to be forgotten, she answered simply. There was nothing more to say. Jed nodded, a deep and sorrowful understanding in his eyes. He climbed back onto his wagon, turned the mules around, and headed back the way they had come, leaving Greta alone with the ruins of her past and the single, heavy, locked-up piece of her future. The last of the sun bled from the sky, and a profound, bone-deep loneliness settled over her. The wind whispered through the broken chinks of the cabin walls, sounding like the sighs of ghosts. Pilgrim nudged her hand, his warm breath a small anchor in the vast, indifferent darkness. She leaned against his sturdy frame, drawing strength from him, and stared at the box. It seemed to absorb the moonlight, giving nothing back. That night, she didn't even try to go inside the cabin. She rolled out her bedroll on the porch, a few feet from the box, with her father's horse as her only watchman. Sleep would not come, she would keep vigil. The first light of dawn was a thin, gray wash that made the valley look like a world of ghosts. Greta rose stiffly from her bedroll, every bone aching with a weariness that was more than physical. Pilgrim whickered softly, his breath plumbing in the chill morning air. Her first act was one of her father's rituals. She walked to the creek, splashed the icy water on her face, and watched the sun crest the eastern ridge. The land was still here. That was the first truth. It had endured, and so would she. She spent the morning making the cabin habitable, or at least bearable. She swept out the years of dust and leaves, patched a section of the roof with loose shingles she found nearby, and used her shawl to clean a pane of glass in the one window that wasn't broken. It was a small act of defiance against the decay, a claim staked against the ruin. By midday, she could ignore the box no longer. It sat on the porch, a silent, brooding presence. She approached it not with hope, but with a grim sense of duty. She ran her hands over its surface again, feeling the bubbled metal and the sharp, warped edges. The lock was a mangled ruin of melted brass and scorched iron. A blacksmith would have to cut it open. But she had no money for a blacksmith, and no trust for any man in Redemption Creek. She was alone with this puzzle. She tried to pry at the lid with a fallen timber, but the wood splintered against the unyielding steel. She tried to find purchase in the seam, but the fire had welded it shut as if with a smith's hammer. Disappointment, cold and familiar, began to seep into her resolve. Had Thorne been right? Had she bankrupted herself for a worthless lump of iron? She slumped down on the porch steps, her head in her hands, the silence of the valley pressing in on her. Pilgrim, sensing her despair, ambled over and nudged her shoulder with his soft nose. She looked up at the old horse, at the gentle wisdom in his dark eyes, and then she looked back at the box. Her gaze fell on the rear corner near the right hinge. There, almost lost in the chaos of blistered metal, was a small, strangely smooth indentation, no bigger than her thumb. It was a dent, a familiar one. Suddenly, a memory, sharp and vivid, broke through the fog of her exhaustion. She was a girl of 10, watching her father in his workshop as he finished the ornate scroll work on the Strongbox, a gift he was making for her mother. He'd been telling a story, gesturing with a small ball-peen hammer, and in his enthusiasm, his hand had slipped. The hammer had flown from his grasp, striking the back corner of the box with a sharp clang. He had cursed softly, then laughed. "Well, little one," he'd said, running a thumb over the mark. "Now it has character, a story only we know." Greta's breath caught in her throat. It was the same dent. The fire had warped everything around it, but the small, perfect circle of the hammer strike was still there. It wasn't just a random mark, it was a flaw, a weakness, a story only they knew. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding with a new, fragile hope. She looked at the dent, then at the hinge just beside it. The fire that had fused the lock and the lid had also, she now realized, put immense stress on the entire frame. Perhaps the force that had sealed the front had weakened the back. She didn't need to break the lock. She needed to break the story. She needed to work on the flaw her father had accidentally, or perhaps providentially, created all those years ago. The box was no longer an impregnable fortress. It was a puzzle, and her father had just given her the first clue. Hope was a dangerous thing, a flickering candle in a high wind, but Greta shielded it with both hands. The clue of the dent was not a key, but a map to where a key might be forged. She would not rush this. Her father had been a patient man, a mender of harnesses, a setter of fences, a man who understood that true strength was in persistence, not force. She would honor him with his own methods. She spent the rest of the day gathering her tools, not the brute force of an axe or a sledgehammer, but the quiet persuasion of her father's old implements, which she found tucked away in a small, miraculously untouched crate in the corner of the cabin. A set of delicate files, a small sharp chisel, a tack hammer, and a pot of rust-colored oil. These were the tools of a craftsman, not a demolitionist. As evening fell, she brought the box inside. She lit a single candle, its flame a small pool of warm light in the vast darkness of the cabin. Pilgrim stood just outside the open door, his slow, rhythmic breathing a counterpoint to the frantic beating of her own heart. She began. First, she cleaned the area around the dent and the hinge, using a rag and some of the oil to wipe away the soot and grime. The steel underneath was blue and purple from the heat of the fire, but it was solid. She took the smallest, sharpest file and began to work, not on the dent itself, but on the warped seam of the lid just above it. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. From a day he was teaching her to repair a broken leather strap. Don't fight the damage, Greta. Find where it wants to give. Persuade it. So she persuaded. The work was slow, painstaking, agonizing. The file skittered and scraped, the sound loud in the silent cabin. For hours she worked, her shoulders aching, her fingers raw. The file created a tiny, gleaming line of fresh metal in the blackened seam. It was barely a scratch, but it was a start. Days passed in this new rhythm. Mornings were for survival, gathering firewood, checking the rabbit snares. Jed had shown her how to make fetching water from the creek. But the afternoons and evenings belonged to the box. She learned its topography of pain, the ridges of warped metal, the valleys of soot. She learned the specific grating sound the file made when it bit into the steel, a sound that became the soundtrack to her life. She worked with a focus so intense it was a form of prayer. During her labor, memories of her father returned, not as painful ghosts, but as gentle instructors. She remembered him fixing her childhood doll, his large, calloused hands impossibly gentle. She remembered him explaining how the grain of wood dictates the path of the saw. Each memory was a lesson in patience, in care, in looking for the hidden structure of things. She wasn't just filing down a piece of metal. She was tracing the lines of her father's character, learning his wisdom through her own hands. The labor transformed her. The soft hands of an orphan were becoming the calloused, capable hands of a homesteader. The grief in her heart was being slowly, painstakingly filed away, replaced by a steely resolve. She was not just opening a box, she was reforging herself. One evening, a week after she had started, something changed. She was working the chisel into the tiny groove she had created, tapping it gently with the small hammer. Instead of the dull, resistant thud she had grown used to, the tap produced a new sound, a faint, resonant ping. A vibration ran through the box and up the chisel into her hand. She froze, her breath held tight in her chest. She tapped it again, a little harder. Ping. The seam, which for days had been an unyielding line of black, now showed a hairline crack, a sliver of darkness deeper than the surrounding soot. It was giving. The persuasion was working. Pilgrim, sensing the shift in her energy, took a step into the cabin, his head lowered, and let out a soft, low nicker. It was as if he, too, understood that a threshold was about to be crossed. She laid down her tools, her hands trembling. Not tonight. This final step required daylight, and a courage she needed to gather from the sun. But as she lay in her bedroll, Staring into the darkness, she knew. The box was ready to speak, and she was ready to listen. The next morning, Greta did not go to the creek. She did not check her snares. She awoke with the sun, a cold knot of anticipation in her stomach, and went straight to the box. She carried it out onto the porch, into the clear, honest light of day. Pilgrim stood close, a silent, steady witness. She took a deep breath, the crisp mountain air doing little to calm the frantic pulse in her throat. She picked up the chisel and the hammer. Her hands were steady now. She placed the tip of the chisel precisely into the hairline crack she had made the night before. She looked at the mountains, her father's mountains, and offered a silent prayer. Then, with a single firm and deliberate strike, she drove the chisel home. There was no loud crack, no explosion of force. Instead, a deep, groaning sigh, like a man waking from a long and troubled sleep. The sound of metal, tortured by fire and then by grief, finally surrendering. The lid, held fast for 5 years by flame and malice, shifted. A dark line appeared along the back edge, widening as the warped hinge finally gave way. Hope, fierce and terrifying, surged through her. She set aside the tools and placed her raw, scraped fingers into the gap. The metal was still sharp, but she barely felt it. She pulled. The lid resisted, then groaned again, and slowly, inch by painful inch, it opened. It screeched in protest, a final cry of defiance before falling back with a heavy clang against the porch floorboards. For a long moment, Greta could only stare, breathless. The inside of the box was a landscape of black. A thick layer of soot and ash coated everything. It smelled of ruin. The fear that it had all been for nothing, that the fire had taken the contents as it had taken the exterior, washed over her. But then she saw it. Nestled in the center, protected by the sheer thickness of the steel walls, was a shape. An oilskin-wrapped package, singed at the edges but miraculously intact. With trembling hands, she reached in and lifted it out. It was heavy, substantial. The oilskin was brittle and cracked in places, but it had done its job. It had protected what lay within. She carefully unwrapped the layers. The oilskin gave way to a thick leather satchel. Her father's satchel. She recognized the tooling on the flap, a simple pattern of a winding river. The Sweetwater. Her fingers fumbled with the buckle, her heart hammering against her ribs. She lifted the flap. Inside, resting on top, was a sheaf of papers, tied with a simple string. The edges were browned, but the script was clear. The deeds, the official, county-stamped deeds to the 2,000 acres of the Sweetwater Valley in the name of Thomas Lowell. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the ink. He had saved them. He had protected them for her. But as the tears fell, she saw that there was something else beneath the deeds. A small, cloth-bound book, a ledger. She lifted it out. It was her father's hand, but it wasn't a record of cattle or grain. The first pages detailed loans, small personal loans made to nearly half the families in Redemption Creek. Loans for seed, for medicine, for a new roof. Next to each entry, in her father's neat script, was the word forgiven. But as she turned the pages, the entries changed. They became a meticulous record of Silas Thorne's father, of his predatory lending, his threats, his consolidation of power. And on the very last page, a folded piece of paper fell out. It was not in her father's hand. It was a confession, signed by a drifter named Abel Marsh, detailing how Silas Thorne Sr. had paid him $50 and a bottle of whiskey to move a dozen of Thorne's own cattle onto Lowell land, and then to testify that he had seen Thomas Lowell do it. It was the truth, all of it. The proof of her father's innocence and the map of Thorne's guilt. The box had not held an inheritance of land. It held an inheritance of justice. The discovery of the ledger left Greta in a state of suspended animation. She sat on the porch as the sun climbed the sky, the deeds in one hand, the proof of her father's honor in the other. The land was hers. The truth was hers. But what to do with it? Riding into Redemption Creek and brandishing the papers felt wrong, a hollow and theatrical gesture. The town had condemned her father on whispers and lies. They would not be convinced by paper and ink alone. Justice, she was beginning to understand, was not a document. It was something you built, like a cabin or a reputation. As she sat pondering this, the sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, began to change. A strange, bruised grayness gathered over the western peaks, and the wind, which had been a gentle whisper, picked up a sudden mournful howl. A storm was coming, not just a squall, but the kind of early winter blizzard that could trap a man and kill him 100 yards from his own door. She hurried to prepare, her new purpose overriding her turmoil. She brought Pilgrim into the relative shelter of the cabin, a breach of etiquette for any other horse, but he was family. She secured the patched roof, stuffed rags into the cracks in the walls, and built up the fire. The ledger and deeds she wrapped carefully and placed back inside the now open strongbox, a new kind of sanctuary. The snow began as fat, wet flakes, but within an hour, it was a blinding, horizontal torrent. The world outside the cabin window dissolved into a churning vortex of white. It was in the heart of this maelstrom that she heard it, a faint cry, almost swallowed by the wind. She froze, listening. It came again, closer this time, a desperate shout. Someone was out there. Without a second thought, she grabbed her father's heavy coat from a peg, lit a lantern, and tied a rope from the porch rail to her waist. To go out was madness. To do nothing was impossible. She plunged into the blizzard, the lantern a feeble sphere of light in the overwhelming chaos. She followed the voice, leaning into the wind, until she stumbled upon them. A family, a man and a woman and 2 small children, huddled against their broken-down wagon, their faces numb with cold and terror. They were immigrants, their German accents thick as they stammered their story. Their axle had broken. They were lost. Greta wasted no time. She led them back, a lifeline of quiet competence in the storm. She brought them into the warmth of the cabin, sat them by the fire, and wrapped the shivering children in her own blankets. The father, a man named Klaus, looked at her with dawning wonder, his family safe in the home of a stranger. Just as a semblance of peace settled in the small cabin, another sound came from the storm. Not a cry for help, but an angry shout, followed by the heavy thud of a fist on the cabin door. "Lowell, I know you're in here. Open this door." It was Silas Thorne. He must have heard she'd opened the box and ridden out to confront her, only to be caught in the same blizzard. Greta stood, her face calm. She looked at the terrified German family, then at the door. Thorne hammered again. "I'll burn this place down around you," he roared, his voice a mixture of fury and desperation. Greta walked to the hearth. Her gaze fell on the ledger. She thought of the names, the families her father had helped. She thought of Thorne's threats. She opened the ledger to the pages detailing her father's forgiven loans, tore one out, and used it to light a splinter of kindling. Then she added it to the fire, a small offering of warmth for the children. She would not let Thorne's darkness in. She barred the door, her back to his rage, and turned to offer the woman a cup of hot water. The storm outside could rage, but inside this small cabin, she was building something else entirely. She was building sanctuary. The blizzard raged for 2 days. Inside the tiny cabin, a strange and quiet community was formed. Greta shared her meager provisions with the German family, whose name was Schmidt. Klaus, the father, was a carpenter by trade and spent the time skillfully mending her broken chair and reinforcing the cabin door. His wife, Anja, showed Greta a way to make the flour stretch further by mixing it with powdered birch bark, a trick from the old country. The children, a boy and a girl, were at first silent and fearful, but soon, lulled by the warmth and Greta's calm presence, they began to chatter in a mix of German and broken English. Thorne's angry shouts had long since been silenced by the storm. He had either given up and turned back, or the blizzard had claimed him. Greta found she did not care which. Her focus was on the life within the 4 walls of the cabin, not the hate outside. When the storm finally broke on the 3rd morning, The world was transformed. It was a silent, pristine landscape of blinding white, the sun sparkling on a thick blanket of unbroken snow. The air was clean, cold, and new. Klaus Schmidt looked out the door, his eyes wide with wonder at the beauty and the lingering terror of the storm. "You saved us," he said to Greta, his voice thick with emotion. "We would have died out there." "You would have done the same," Greta replied simply. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact about the nature of decency. Klaus insisted on leaving as soon as a path could be cleared. "I must tell the people in the town," he said. "They must know what you did. They must know there is a good woman in this valley." He did not know the half of it, but Greta simply nodded. She sent him with directions and a small parcel of food for the journey. A week later, just as the snow had melted enough to make the road passable again, a buggy appeared in the valley. It was not Jed this time. It was Mr. Abernathy, the county clerk from the capital, a man known for his meticulous nature and unwavering honesty. Jed sat beside him, looking immensely pleased with himself. Mr. Abernathy, a small man with spectacles and a kind, serious face, accepted a cup of coffee from Greta and got straight to the point. Jed had ridden to the capital as soon as the storm cleared, fetching him with a wild story. "He said you had a claim to make," Abernathy said, his eyes gentle but perceptive. Without a word, Greta retrieved the Strongbox. She laid the deeds and the ledger on the rough-hewn table. Abernathy spent the next hour poring over the documents in complete silence, occasionally letting out a small or adjusting his spectacles. He compared the deeds to the plat maps he had brought. He read every entry in the ledger. He examined Abel Marsh's signed confession under a magnifying glass. Finally, he looked up, his expression unreadable. He removed his spectacles and polished them carefully. "These deeds are impeccably in order," he announced. "And this ledger, this is more than a record of accounts. This is a testament of character." He tapped the confession. "And this is a key." The three of them rode into Redemption Creek the next day. Abernathy had requested a public meeting at the saloon. The whole town turned out, buzzing with curiosity. Silas Thorne was there, his face still showing the signs of frostbite from his ordeal in the storm, his arrogance replaced by a sullen, wary silence. Abernathy stood on a crate and in his calm, clear voice laid out the facts. He spoke of the legal validity of the Lowell deeds. He spoke of the contents of the ledger, reading aloud not the debts, but the record of her father's forgiveness. He did not accuse Thorne directly. He simply held up the confession and said, "The truth, it seems, has a way of enduring even through fire." A profound silence fell over the saloon. The townspeople looked at Thorne, then at Greta. They were not looking at the daughter of a hanged criminal anymore. They were looking at the rightful owner of the Sweetwater Valley, a woman who had faced down storms both natural and human, and had emerged, not with vengeance, but with quiet, unshakable dignity. The town's memory, so long poisoned by a lie, was beginning to heal. The seasons turned. Spring came to the Sweetwater Valley, and with it, new life. The snow melted, feeding the creek until it ran full and fast, and the meadows erupted in a riot of green grass and wildflowers. The valley was waking up, and so was the Lowell homestead. Klaus Schmidt, true to his word, returned with his family. He brought with him 2 other German families, all of them good, hard-working people who had been drawn by the promise of a place where a person's character mattered more than their name. They had come not as tenants, but as partners. Greta had offered them each a parcel of land in exchange for their help in rebuilding. They raised a new barn first, a symbol of community effort, its unpainted timbers smelling of pine and promise. Then, together, they began to build a new house for Greta, on the foundations of the old one. Silas Thorne was a changed man, humbled by the storm, silenced by the truth, and shunned by the very town he had sought to control. He had become a ghost in his own life. He did not flee. Instead, he remained a quiet, solitary figure. One day he rode out to the valley. Greta saw him coming from a distance and met him by the creek. He didn't dismount. He looked at the new barn, at the people working together in the fields. "My father was wrong," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual bluster. "He was wrong about your father, and I was wrong about you." He reached into his coat and produced a heavy leather pouch. "This is the money my father took from Abel Marsh after the trial. He was afraid the man would talk. I found it in his papers." He tossed the bag to the ground. It landed with a soft thud. "It's yours, a debt repaid." He turned his horse and rode away without another word. Greta did not pick up the money. She left it there for the rain to wash clean. By the time the golden light of late summer settled over the valley, the new house was finished. It was a simple, sturdy structure, built of local pine and stone with a wide porch that looked out over the fields. Jed, his work done, now sat on that porch in a rocking chair Klaus had built him, his days of worry over. Pilgrim, the old horse, grazed peacefully in the pasture, a living monument to loyalty. The town of Redemption Creek had begun to change, too. Inspired by Greta's example and Abernathy's quiet authority, the people had started to untangle themselves from the web of the Thornes' influence, forming their own council, making their own way. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, Greta stood on her new porch, a cup of cool water in her hand. Klaus' children were chasing fireflies in the yard, their laughter mingling with the sound of the crickets. She looked out at the land, at the home, at the community she had nurtured from the ashes of her past. She had the deeds, she had the land, but she understood now what the box had truly held. She placed a hand on the smooth, planed wood of the porch, railing her new friends had built. "He didn't leave me land," she murmured to the quiet evening. "He left me a truth to tend." And with those quiet words, a legacy of shame was transformed into a future of grace. Thank you for joining us for this story of endurance and quiet vindication. If you were moved by Greta's journey, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our next story of hidden histories and unexpected heroes. Until then, may you always look for the truth hidden beneath the surface.